Throughout the upper Midwest in the 1830s, the white settlers wanted land belonging to the Indians. Political pressure was brought to bear, and the Indians were forced to move. In the spring of 1840, Colonel Henry Atkinson arrived at Fort Winnebago in central Wisconsin. The colonel had 1,000 soldiers with him. The Winnebago tribe was to be moved westward, across the Mississippi River. Under the guns of the Army, some 3,000 Winnebago men, women, and children began the forced march to Iowa. This is a later photograph of Chief Yellow Thunder. Colonel Atkinson put him in jail for delaying the march. Chief Yellow Thunder and other Winnebago leaders shown here bitterly complained about the United States government and the Army. In 1840, Iowa was largely Indian territory. The neutral ground separated enemy tribes and was unoccupied. It was on this open land that the Winnebago were now forced to live. They were surrounded by their ancient enemies, the Iowa, the Sac and Fox, the Sioux. To protect and control the Winnebago, the Army built a fort in the neutral ground. It was named Fort Atkinson after the colonel. These photographs were taken after the Winnebago left Iowa. The government reported that construction of Fort Atkinson was necessary to protect the Winnebago from Indian enemies. This was partly true. Actually, the mounted men and infantry spent much of their time recapturing fugitive Winnebago families who attempted to return to Wisconsin. An Indian agency was built near the fort. The government men lived in comfortable limestone houses. The Winnebago lived under primitive conditions nearby. The Winnebago only lived in Iowa 8 years. Newly arrived white settlers wanted the Winnebago land in Iowa for themselves. Through a series of treaties, the Winnebago were relocated again, first in Minnesota and later in Nebraska. Eventually, many returned to Wisconsin. The buildings, foundations, and the artifacts found within Fort Atkinson give us a glimpse of daily life on the Iowa frontier. The North Barracks stands as a reminder of the 1840s. But what did the fort look like when it was a frontier stronghold? The fort plan provides one answer.
Dan, I'd like to explain to you about Fort Atkinson from the map drawn by Lieutenant Reynolds in 1842. Take a look over here. This is the road on the map, and from Fort Atkinson to the Mississippi, there's 50-mile trail and absolutely no settlement between Fort Atkinson and the Mississippi. This road led down the bluffs and across the floodplain about 4 miles from here to the Indian Agency. Now, because the soldiers were out here on the frontier, they raised their own produce. This is their garden. The stables, a granary, a quartermaster and his wagons here, and shops like the carpenter shop, blacksmith shop, and laundry area. This is the main fort itself.
Archaeological work in the 1940s tested the fort plan and found it to be accurate. These old photographs show details of construction, details no longer to be seen at the fort. Even with this information, there were unanswered questions. A new study was undertaken. The starting point was this sketch of the fort, drawn by Lieutenant Reynolds in 1842. Details faint on the original have been redrawn, and color has been added. The limestone blockhouse on the southwest corner flanked 2 sides of the fort. In case of attack, it provided covering fire with rifles and cannon. Rifle forts were narrow on the outside to protect the soldier from enemy bullets. Most of the interior roof dates from the 1840s. After the fort was abandoned, the blockhouse was used as a stable. This 19th century photograph shows that the actual building was not seriously damaged. It was restored to its original appearance in the 1950s. Below the blockhouse, the soldiers quarried limestone for the buildings. The South Barracks formed part of the defense perimeter. Limestone footings correspond with the fort plan. 2 companies, about 140 enlisted men, lived in the crowded barracks. Dormitories were upstairs, kitchens and sitting rooms were downstairs. The west barracks behind the stockade had apartments for junior officers and their families. Absence of limestone footings show the huge barracks had a weak foundation. The sutler's store was the old-time PX. Soldiers bought candy, tobacco, and other personal items on credit. The log commissary was strongly built and was a corner of the fort. The rebuilt log stockade is deceptive. The original fort corner would have looked like this. Uniforms, weapons, ammunition, and other military items were issued from the commissary. This then was Fort Atkinson, sketched by Reynolds. South Barracks, Stone Quarry, Blockhouse, stockade with rifle slits, officers' quarters, sutler's store, commissary. Wives of the enlisted men lived in cabins outside the fort. Comparing the modern appearance of the south and west sides with the drawing shows many changes. Only the blockhouse survived, but limestone foundations remain, as a reminder of buildings long gone. In this part of the fort, only the central section of the north barracks still stands. Originally much longer, it provided quarters for about 70 enlisted men. The east part of the barracks was the hospital. 19th century photographs show the collapse of the building over many years. The outside stairway and veranda was part of the original plan. Only the central section remained when the state purchased the site. The interior was remodeled and strengthened in the 1950s to be the Fort Museum. From the fort plan, measurements, foundations, and photographs, we can reconstruct the original appearance of the barracks. 2 of the 3 companies stationed at Fort Atkinson were mounted infantry called dragoons. These were dress uniforms of the 1st Dragoons. Everyday clothing was plainer. Enlisted men were rarely issued new uniforms and usually appeared shabby. By the later 1840s, less ornate dress uniforms were issued to the mounted infantry. The guardhouse. Usually 2 or 3 enlisted men were in confinement here for drunkenness, insubordination, or desertion, according to fort records. The rebuilt stone wall outlines the hospital area of the north barracks. The gate and stockade have been rebuilt. The east barracks, located in front of this stockade, was destroyed by fire after the garrison left. The east barracks housed senior officers and their families. Excavations in 1940 uncovered porch foundations, cellars, and a basement fireplace. The powder magazine is an original building. It was designed to be fireproof. The shingles cover a vaulted masonry roof, and air vents are offset to keep the powder dry and prevent accidental ignition during enemy attack. The northeast blockhouse was rebuilt in the 1920s and copied the original. The drawings, plans, and foundations are combined to illustrate a perspective view. A visitor in the 1840s would have seen the blockhouse, west barracks with gardens, parade ground, north and east barracks, 3 large stables for the horses, the granary for feed, quartermaster's stables for the wagon trains, the bakery for the bread ration, the blacksmith shop, carpenter shop, houses for the enlisted men's wives, and the laundry. The fort was never attacked. Its blockhouses and stockade were never tested in battle. Land in the neutral strip became valuable to the white settlers. The Winnebagos were again forced to move, this time to Minnesota. A year later, the soldiers withdrew from the fort. The abandoned fort became a farm, and buildings fell to disrepair or were pulled down for reuse by the civilian population as building materials. A view from the stables area to the shops. None of these buildings survived. Unexcavated foundations lie buried outside the fort.
Historic archaeology often has a different emphasis than research at a prehistoric site. My first goal at Fort Atkinson was to bring together information on the structures. This work provided the basis for the artist drawings which you've seen. My second goal was to locate and study fort period artifacts. Unfortunately, the artifacts found during the 1940 excavations dated mainly from early settlers and the farm period. Ceramic trademarks definitely established this fact when I examined the collections. This is why I located the officers' privies, to get fort period artifacts for study. This is the officers' quarters, and these are officers' quarters. And behind each of these officers' quarters, you have gardens. And I noted that there were privies located here on the map. And so we excavated these, and this is where we found all of the china and glassware that we obtained from the excavation. And these privies and the two privies here. And it was from this area that we really obtained a unique inventory of the kinds of things used at the fort. Because anytime anything broke at the fort, in the officers' barracks, they'd simply carry it out and throw it into the privy. My crew excavated these privies in 6-inch levels, but analysis of trademarks and assured distributions showed no significant stratigraphic differences. The privies were only 3 to 4 feet deep and had been emptied and cleaned out at various times during the military occupation. Ceramic dating led me to conclude that most of the artifacts were thrown away by the last garrison, officers of the 6th U.S. Infantry Company. They were cleaning house before they left in 1849.
In 1966, Dr. McCusick located and excavated the officers' privies. Privies are outhouses, for there was no indoor plumbing at Fort Atkinson. The stone-lined privies were shallow because of underlying bedrock. Enlisted men were assigned to clean them out at regular intervals. Archaeologists found the privies contained all kinds of artifacts. The trash of yesterday is a treasure today. Homemade bone dominoes, a trade bead, clay pipe, children's marbles, slate and stylus for writing, chamber pots, basin, water jug, brass uniform button. Artifacts found in the Fort Atkinson privies are dated by patents and trademarks. This tells us that these artifacts were thrown away in the late fall and winter of 1849. It seems that the privies were filled with trash when the officers' barracks were cleaned up, just before the last garrison of Army troops left.
Dan, the identification of China on one of these frontier forts is very interesting because it's all English imports. The officers' wives had very fine china with them. Let me just give you an example. This plate can be identified as being made by William Ridgway and Son. This particular pattern was made between 1838 and 1848. So it was really quite a new piece. when it was broken and thrown away. It takes just a bit of thought to realize what this is. It's an ink reservoir used with a quill pen. It had a cork in here for the ink, and then the ink flowed in through this hole and filled up. You would block any further ink filling with the cork, and it would be a little reservoir to dip the pen into. We found this complete lock in a privy. Apparently the blacksmith couldn't repair it, and they threw it away and requisitioned a new one. This is the kind of porcelain knob that fits right on the lock. You'll note it has an imitation wood grain finish. This was a popular pattern in the mid-19th century. Finally, on the frontier with the mounted men, currycombs were common, and this is a broken one thrown away. The iron tang had a wooden handle. We found this ink bottle in Privy 1. You've made a study of some of the other bottles. Perhaps you can explain it for us.
Okay, this bottle is easily identifiable as a large champagne bottle and would be a French import. The smaller champagne bottle is a split and is about half the volume of the full size.
And these are just exactly like champagne bottles in use now.
Yes. They're identical in appearance. And also the large fine wine bottle with the high basal kick-up is also an import. And this is similar in form to current types.
Yes. You mentioned that there are some other French imports here.
Yes, there's a fragment of a olive oil bottle from Bordeaux, and it still has the seal intact. And the seal reads, Huile d'olive, Serfine clarifiée, Bordeaux, which is a clear olive oil from Bordeaux. This other one, which has been reconstructed, has the high basal kick-up in it, and is also a very fine glass olive oil bottle with a glass seal, which reads Huile Serfine.
Now, you've mentioned to me that in addition to the French imports, champagne, wine, and olive oil, you found some evidence of British imports.
Well, we have one fragmented brandy bottle with basal lettering that reads it's from Bristol.
Bristol, England.
Yes. And we have some domestic imports to the frontier, such as this bourbon bottle, which would most likely have come from Kentucky.
Most of the whiskey that I've read about coming into the neutral ground was coming in kegs, but I presume the officers were drinking, by and large, a higher quality.
In the culinary varieties, we have this bottle, which is a rectangular in shape, and it's a ground pepper bottle.
Well, this was one bottle that I had a great deal of difficulty identifying its use. How do you know that it contained ground pepper?
Well, I based that on the comparative analysis with the collections from the Bertrand.
Oh, the Steamboat Bertrand that went down. They still found some bottles with labels and so on them.
Yes, they were intact, and based on reconstruction of this for dimensions and form, it corresponds with the ground pepper.
So that would be ground pepper.
And this one, which is rather ornate, based also on the Bertrand collections, one would expect this to be a decanter of some sort, but is in reality a pickled vegetable bottle. This is a stemmed drinking glass, which would be possibly for a liqueur.
And of course this is a water glass, also the fluted sides on it. This is fairly typical of the kinds of glassware and bottles, throwaway items we found at the fort. I think it's interesting that we have French, British imports way out here 50 miles beyond the edge of the settled frontier.
Throughout North America, historic sites of the frontier are being studied. The buildings, foundations, and the artifacts found within them give us a glimpse of daily life on the frontier, providing new dimensions to our history. Fort Atkinson is maintained by the Iowa State Conservation Commission, located in northeastern Iowa, overlooking a small town later named for the fort. Fort Atkinson is one of the high points of a visit to northeast Iowa.